The county surplus yard in Harlan, Kansas, smelled like cut weeds and old iron. 8 cattle guards sat in a crooked row near the back fence, stacked too high on wooden pallets that had already started to rot. The steel grates were rusted brown-black, mud packed between the crossbars, fence wire and ragweed threaded through the gaps. A few bars on the second unit were bent inward, like something heavy had sat on them for years. The paint was gone. The bolt plates were orange with corrosion. Evelyn Mercer stood in front of them with her hands in her jacket pockets and said nothing for a long time. Marty Hobbs walked over from the office trailer, clipboard in hand. He managed the surplus yard for the county road department and had been trying to move these guards since fall. Nobody wanted them. He had already dropped the price twice. Those came off the old crossings out on Route 9 and Sycamore Road, Marty said. County pulled them 2 years ago when they redid the approaches. They're not approved for public road use anymore. Wouldn't pass inspection. Evelyn crouched beside the nearest one and ran her thumb along a crossbar. She pressed down on it, tested the flex, moved to the next bar, and did the same thing. Some of these bars are still sound, she said. Some, Marty agreed. But the ones that aren't will fold under a loaded truck. That's why they came out. Evelyn stood and walked to the second stack. She checked the frame rails, the width, the spacing between bars. She pulled a small tape measure from her coat and measured the overall length. "I'll take all 8, she said. Marty looked at the clipboard, then back at her. "All 8? Load all 8. He wrote up the receipt at scrap price. $460 for the lot. Evelyn paid in cash and pulled her truck and flatbed around to the back gate while Marty called for a loader. Ray Cullen was parked near the front of the yard, loading a used culvert pipe onto his trailer. He ran cattle on the next place south of Evelyn's, about 300 head on a mix of upland and creek-bottom pasture. Good operation, good fences, pipe gates with heavy chains and snap latches at every opening. He watched Evelyn's flatbed sag under the first 2 guards and walked over. "Evelyn, what in the world are you going to do with those?" "Use them? For what?" "They pulled those off the county roads because they're shot. Half the bars are soft. You couldn't put a feed truck across one without wondering if the front axle was coming through."
"I'm not running trucks across them."
Ray waited for more. Evelyn didn't offer any. He shook his head and went back to his trailer. By the time Evelyn got home, Mara was already in the lot, sorting replacement ear tags at the tailgate of her own truck. Mara was 30, Evelyn's niece, and she had been helping run the cow-calf operation since Evelyn's husband died 4 years earlier. She was capable, organized, and direct. She could pull a calf, back a trailer in the dark, and keep the books straight through tax season. She watched the flatbed come up the lane, carrying 4 tons of rusted steel, and set down the tag pliers. "What is that?" "Cattle guards. 8 of them. From the county? Surplus yard." Mara walked to the trailer and looked at the grates. Rust flaked off under her fingers. Mud fell out of the crossbar gaps in dry chunks. One frame had a weld crack along the corner. "These are off old road crossings," Mara said. "They pulled them because they're worn out. They pulled them because they don't meet road spec anymore. That's not the same thing. What are you going to do with them?" "I'll show you tomorrow." The next morning, Evelyn drove Mara down to the south pasture in the side-by-side. The south pasture was low ground, 60 acres of creek-bottom grass that flooded in heavy spring rain. The creek ran along the east edge. Drainage ditches cut across the northwest corner, where the county road passed. 3 gates opened onto farm lanes that connected the pasture to the working lots and the road. Evelyn stopped at the first gate, a standard pipe gate chained to a cedar corner post. The gate was solid. The chain was good. The latch worked clean. "Look at the post," Evelyn said. Mara looked. About 14 inches up the cedar, there was a faint gray line where old floodwater had stained the wood. Below that line, the bark was stripped smooth. A tangle of dried grass and plastic baling twine was caught in the fence wire 2 feet from the gate. "That's from the flood in '94, Evelyn said. "Water sat against this gate for almost 2 days. The gate held. The gate held that time. Look at the bottom rail." Mara crouched. Along the base of the gate, a shallow groove in the mud showed where debris had packed against the pipe. The ground beneath was eroded slightly, creating a gap between the gate bottom and the dirt. "Now look at the cattle trail." Mara followed Evelyn's eyes. A worn path led from the pasture straight to the gate opening. The cattle walked this trail every time they came up from the creek bottom to the working lot. It was the easiest ground, packed hard, familiar. "When floodwater comes through here, it pushes everything downstream," Evelyn said. "Sticks, fence wire, old feed sacks, whatever the creek carries. That debris packs under the gate, catches on the chain, pushes against the latch. Sometimes it bends the latch open. Sometimes it lifts the chain off the post. Sometimes it doesn't break anything at all. It just leans the post enough that the gate swings. Abia, so we reinforce the chain. Put a double latch on it. The chain's not the problem." Mara waited. "The problem is what happens after the water goes down. The gate opens, maybe 6 inches, maybe 2 feet, and you might not get down here to fix it for a day or 2 if the roads wash out. So, what are the cattle guards for? They go behind the gates, on the pasture side." Mara looked at her. Behind the gates, 3 openings, 2 guards at each one. "Evelyn, cattle guards go on driveway crossings, not behind gates. These aren't going on driveways." Evelyn didn't explain further. She walked the fence line, checking the other 2 low gates, pointing out debris marks and erosion at each one. Mara followed and asked twice more what the guards were actually supposed to do. Evelyn gave the same answer both times. They go behind the gates. That afternoon, Clay Barnes drove out to look at the grates. Clay was 71, a retired welder and backhoe operator who had spent 40 years building and repairing ranch infrastructure across the county. He had set cattle guards on private crossings, cut drainage channels, poured concrete wing walls, and welded more pipe gates than he could count. He walked along the row of rusted guards where Evelyn had unloaded them near the barn, and tapped each frame with a ball-peen hammer. He checked welds. He pushed on crossbars. He kicked the corner joints. 4 of these are decent, he said. Sound frames. Most of the bars will hold weight. 2 more are usable if I replace some crossbars with angle iron. The other 2 are scrap. 6 is enough, Evelyn said. Enough for what, exactly? I want them set in the ground at 3 gate openings on the south pasture. 2 guards per opening, 1 behind the gate and 1 about 8 feet further in, on the pasture side. Gravel bed underneath. Drainage gaps so water passes through. Wing fencing on both sides so nothing walks around. Clay looked at her. You're putting cattle guards behind gates? Behind the gates, on the pasture side. That's backwards from anything I've ever built. I know. A cattle guard goes on a driveway crossing, so you don't need a gate. You're putting them where there's already a gate. The gate's not the last line. Clay rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the grates again. "These are ugly, Evelyn. They don't need to be pretty. They need to be there when the gate isn't enough." He thought about it. He didn't agree, but he didn't refuse. He said he would bring the backhoe Thursday. It took Clay and Evelyn 4 days to set the first pair. Clay dug the pits with the backhoe, leveled the beds, laid gravel for drainage, and set the guards into the excavations, so the crossbars sat flush with the ground surface. He welded new angle iron crossbars onto the sections where the old bars had weakened. He anchored the frames to buried railroad ties with lag bolts. Evelyn handled the wing, fencing herself, running 3 strands of cable from each guard frame to the nearest fence post, closing off the sides so a cow couldn't simply step around. The drainage was Evelyn's insistence. She made Clay leave gaps beneath the guard frames and gravel channels on both sides so water could pass under and around the grates without backing up. "If these turn into dams, they'll make the flooding worse and they'll wash out," she said. "The water has to go through." By the following week, all 3 openings were fitted. 2 guards at each gate, pasture side, with gravel beds, drainage gaps, anchored frames, and wing fencing. They looked rough, rusted steel in muddy pits behind perfectly good pipe gates. Mara didn't say it was a waste, but she didn't say it wasn't. Ray Cullen drove past while Clay was finishing the last set. He slowed his truck, looked at the installation through the fence, and kept driving. At the sale barn that Saturday, he mentioned it to 2 other ranchers. Evelyn Mercer bought 8 rusted cattle guards off the county and buried them behind her gates, he said. "I don't know what she thinks that's going to stop." Nobody argued with him. It did look strange spring came in wet that year. March brought 3 inches of rain in 2 weeks. The creek rose and sat against the south pasture fence for a day before dropping. Evelyn walked the gates the morning after. At the second gate, she found what she expected. Debris had washed against the base of the pipe gate during the night. A mat of sticks, old baling twine, and creek grass was packed against the bottom rail. The chain had slipped down about 2 inches on the post, and the latch had a slight bend where pressure from the gate had torqued it sideways. The gate had moved. Not much, about 4 inches, but it had moved. Behind it, the first cattle guard sat in its gravel pit, clean and draining. Water had passed through the crossbar gaps and out the drainage channels on both sides. Debris had caught against the upstream edge of the grate, but the guard itself hadn't shifted. Mara came down an hour later and saw the mud line, the bent latch, and the shifted gate. She stood there looking at the gap where the gate had pulled away from the post, and then at the cattle guard sitting solid behind it. "That was 3 inches of rain," Evelyn said. "The forecast for April is worse." Mara fixed the latch that afternoon. Evelyn helped her clear the debris from the gate base and reset the chain. They checked all 3 openings. 2 were clean. 1 had moved. Clay came out the following week and inspected the guard installations. He checked the frame anchors, the gravel, the drainage, and the wing fencing. Everything had held. "I'll say this," Clay told Evelyn. "The drainage works. Water went right through. I figured the gravel would wash out, but it didn't. That's why I wanted the gaps." He nodded slowly. He still wasn't sure the whole idea made sense, but the installation was sound, and it had survived the first test without moving. April opened warm and stayed wet. The long-range forecast called for sustained rain through the 3rd week. The creek was already high. County road crews started checking culverts and low-water crossings. The soil was saturated. Every new inch of rain had nowhere to go but downstream. On April 14th, it started raining before dawn and didn't stop. 2 inches by noon, another inch by evening. The creek came out of its banks overnight. By the next morning, the south pasture had standing water across the lowest 20 acres. The cattle had already moved to the high side on their own, clustering near the fence line above the working lots. Evelyn moved the pairs with calves into the upper lot before the water reached the lane. She closed and double-chained every gate she could reach. Then she went back to the house and waited. The rain kept falling. By the second night, the creek bottom was a wide brown sheet of moving water, carrying branches, fence posts, feed sacks, plastic drums, and sections of old wire. The county road east of Evelyn's place flooded in 2 low spots. A sheriff's deputy set up barricades on both ends. The water peaked late on the second night and began to drop by morning. That was when the damage showed. Ray Cullen's south gate, a heavy pipe gate with a good chain and a solid latch, had taken a full load of debris during the flood. Creek trash had packed against the bottom rail, caught on the chain, and pressed against the gate for 16 hours. The latch hadn't broken, the chain hadn't snapped, but the corner post had leaned 3 inches downstream under the sustained pressure, and the gate had swung open about 2.5 feet. By the time the water dropped enough for the ground to show, 14 of Ray's cows and 6 calves had walked through the opening and onto the county road. A mile north, Wayne Jessup's electric fence along his creek-bottom hayfield had shorted when floodwater submerged the bottom wire, and a fallen branch grounded out the charger. His cattle found the dead section and pushed through. 23 head spread across the hayfield and into the ditch along the state highway. The deputy, who had been running barricades all morning, had to pull off flood duty to slow traffic on the highway, while Wayne and his son tried to push them back on foot through knee-deep mud. South of Ray's place, the Pettiford operation lost cattle through a different kind of failure. Their low pasture gate held, but a 6-foot section of woven wire fence beside it tore loose from the corner post when a cottonwood limb caught in the mesh during the flood. When the water dropped, 8 calves and 3 cows walked through the gap, crossed a drainage ditch, and ended up standing on the county road shoulder a 1/4 mile from the main intersection. A cattle hauler coming through had to stop and wait 40 minutes before the road cleared. The deputy spent 2 days running between situations. Feed trucks couldn't reach 2 operations south of the creek because loose cattle were blocking a farm lane, and nobody could get a trailer past until the animals were moved. A veterinarian trying to reach a calving emergency at the Jessup place had to detour 11 miles on gravel because the direct route was closed. Nobody lost cattle to the flood itself. The water hadn't been deep enough or fast enough to drown grown animals on that terrain. The problem was never the water. The problem was what happened after it left. Gates opened, fence sections gave way, openings appeared, and cattle, doing exactly what cattle do, walked toward familiar ground through whatever gap the flood had made. Evelyn's south pasture took the same flood, the same creek, the same debris, the same sustained pressure on the same low-ground fence line. Her second gate took the worst of it. The pipe gate held at the hinges, but debris had packed under the bottom rail and against the chain. The latch bent. The chain slipped off the top of the post. The gate swung open almost 3 feet. Behind that open gate, 2 rusted cattle guards sat in their gravel pits. Water had passed through the crossbar gaps and drained out both sides. Debris had caught against the upstream edge of the first grate. Sticks and baling twine matted across the bars, but the frames hadn't moved. The railroad tie anchors had held. The wing fencing was intact on both sides. Evelyn walked down the morning after the water dropped. She could see the cattle trail in the mud. Her cows had come down from the high ground the same way they always did, following the packed path toward the gate opening. She could read the tracks. They had walked to within 8 feet of the open gate, reached the first cattle guard, and stopped the hoofprints, turned sideways, milled around, then went back. Not one animal had crossed. A gate doesn't have to break to let cattle out. It only has to open once. But a cow won't step onto a surface she doesn't trust. The grate under her hooves feels wrong. The gaps between the bars look wrong. The footing is uncertain. Even with an open gate and dry ground on the other side, she stops. She looks, and she turns around. Every herd in the creek bottom that week found an opening the flood had left behind. Every herd followed familiar ground toward that opening, and every herd that reached a gap with nothing behind it walked right through. Evelyn's cattle reached an opening with a rusted cattle guard across it, and they didn't. Mara was behind her, carrying a fence tool and a come-along. She saw the open gate. She saw the tracks. She saw the cattle guard sitting in the mud with debris on its face and water still draining through the gravel underneath. The gate opened, Mara said. I expected it to, but they didn't go through Ada Bead floodwater leaves. But an open gate keeps working. Every cow on this place knows that trail. They come up from the bottom the same way every time. If the gate's open, they walk through because the ground feels right. But if there's a grate across the path, the ground doesn't feel right anymore. The opening stops being a road. Mara stood there for a long time, looking at the grate, the tracks, and the open gate beyond. You were never trying to keep the gate from opening. No, I'm not trying to stop the water. I'm trying to stop what walks through after it leaves. They spent the rest of the morning clearing debris from the guards, resetting gravel that had washed thin on the downstream side, and checking the wing fencing. One cable had stretched but held. Evelyn tightened it. The other 2 openings had survived with less damage. Both gates had held, and the guards behind them were clean and draining. Clay came out 2 days later. He walked every installation with his hammer and a level. He checked frame anchors, crossbar welds, drainage flow, and wing fencing tension. He spent a long time studying the tracks in the mud at the second gate. The frames didn't move, he said. The anchors held, and the drainage kept them from backing up water. That was the point. Clay straightened up and looked at the open gate, then back at the cattle guard. You didn't keep the gate from opening, he said. You kept the opening from becoming a road. Evelyn looked at him. That was the part I cared about. He nodded. He didn't say anything else for a while. Then he said, I've been building ranch gates for 40 years. I always figured if the gate held, the job was done. I never thought about what happens when it doesn't hold and the water's already gone. Most years you don't have to think about it. This wasn't most years. Ray Cullen drove over that evening. He looked tired. He'd spent 2 days pushing cattle out of ditches and off the county road. His fences needed work in 3 places, and his south gate post would have to be reset with concrete. He stood at Evelyn's second gate and looked at the installation, the open gate, the cattle guard, the tracks that stopped and turned back. How many did you lose? He asked. None got out. He didn't say anything about the rusted grates or the county surplus yard. He looked at the guard for a long time, then looked at the gate, then back at the guard. I had good gates, he said quietly. You did. They weren't enough. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ray drove home. He didn't ask to buy any of her cattle guards. He didn't make a speech about learning a lesson. He just left quietly, the same way he'd come. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn and Mara repaired the fences, reset the gate posts, replaced the bent latch, and rehung the chain. They added gravel to the guard pits where drainage had thinned the bed. They retensioned the wing cables. The work was slow and muddy, and none of it looked heroic. The county road crew replaced 3 culverts that spring. 2 neighbors rebuilt fence lines. Ray reset his south gate post in concrete and added a second chain. Wayne Jessup replaced his charger and raised his bottom wire. The deputy filed reports on livestock-related road that kept the county attorney's office busy through June. Evelyn filed nothing. She had nothing on the road. 2 months later, another storm warning came across the weather radio. Strong line of storms expected. 2 to 3 inches possible. Creek levels already above normal. Mara pulled on her boots and drove the side-by-side down to the south pasture before Evelyn was off the porch. She went to the second gate first. She walked past the pipe gate without stopping. She went straight to the cattle guard. She cleared a mat of dead grass from the crossbars. She checked the wing fencing on both sides. She looked at the drainage gap and kicked a small stone out of the channel. She tested the frame anchor with her boot. Then she walked back to the gate and checked the chain and the latch. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some things you can teach with words, and some things only make sense after you've stood in the mud and read the tracks yourself. Evelyn had understood it for years. Now Mara understood it too. The gate was never the last line. The opening was. If you'd like to hear more rural stories about forgotten farm wisdom that still works when it matters, subscribe now. By the next storm warning, Mara checked the grates before she checked the chains.